The chill of a late autumn wind has a unique cruelty to it. It doesn't just bite at your skin, it seeps into your bones, a damp and persistent reminder of decay. It was the very same chill that seemed to have taken permanent residence in my life. My name is Alistair Finch. I'm 29 years old, and though some still call me Lord Finch out of habit or pity, I am the lord of nothing but debt and dust. The sprawling estate of Finchwood Manor, my ancestral home, was now a hollowed-out carcass of its former glory, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at fields I no longer truly owned. Everything of value had been sold off, piece by painful piece, to cover the catastrophic debts my father had left behind. And so I found myself here, in a muddy, trampled market square in Norfolk, a place reeking of wet livestock and desperation. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my threadbare coat pulled tight, a futile defense against the wind and the far more cutting gazes of the people around me. They knew who I was. They knew of the Finch's fall from grace, a story told in hushed tones in every tavern and parlor in the county. Some looked at me with a kind of morbid pity, others with a smug satisfaction that only comes from witnessing the mighty brought low. I felt each look like a physical blow, a fresh layer of shame plastering itself onto my soul. In my pocket, my fingers nervously traced the edges of 2 heavy coins. £2. It was the last of the money from the sale of my mother's final piece of jewelry. It was everything I'd left in this world. The auctioneer, a stout man with a face reddened by the cold and cheap ale, was conducting his business with a booming, theatrical voice that grated on my nerves. He sold off a lame horse, 3 pigs, and a set of rusted farm tools with equal, passionless enthusiasm. It was a grim parade of misfortune, of men and women selling what little they had to survive another week. I was just a spectator in their misery, sharing in the sentiment, if not the spectacle. I had nothing left to sell. I had come to the market for no reason other than to feel the press of a crowd around me, to escape the suffocating silence of my empty house. It was a mistake. The noise and the smells only amplified my own isolation. Just as I was about to turn and retreat to my solitary ruin, the auctioneer's tone shifted. "And now, folks," he bellowed, a sly grin spreading across his face, "we have a unique lot. A special case, you might say." 2 burly men dragged a figure onto the raised wooden platform. It was a woman, or at least the shape of one. Her hands were bound loosely in front of her, and her dress was little more than a collection of coarse, patched-up rags. But the most startling, most dehumanizing feature was the rough burlap sack that had been pulled down over her head, completely obscuring her face and hair. A collective gasp and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wife-selling was a sordid, unofficial custom in the forgotten corners of England, a desperate and ugly solution for the destitute. But I had never seen it done with such calculated cruelty, with a sack that turned a person into a faceless object. Acquired from a debtor's prison, the auctioneer announced, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. Guaranteed to be of sound health and compliant nature. Strong back for labor, and quiet, very quiet. He prodded her shoulder with the end of his walking stick, and she flinched but made no sound. The sack remained perfectly still. "What am I bid for this fine specimen? Shall we start the bidding at £1? A tense silence fell over the square. This was a step beyond selling a lame horse. This was trafficking in human misery in its rawest form. Then a grimy-faced blacksmith near the front grunted, £1. He looked her up and down, a predatory gleam in his eye. £1 it is, the auctioneer crowed. £1 for a lifetime of service. Can I get £1, 10 shillings? An old farmer, known for his lecherous gaze and foul temper, raised a crooked finger. £1, 10. My stomach turned. I saw not a woman, but a reflection of my own predicament. Trapped, humiliated, stripped of identity and dignity, sold off for scraps. My father's words echoed in my mind, from a time when Finchwood was still filled with light and warmth. Honor, Alistair, he used to say, is the only thing a man truly owns. It cannot be bought or sold. And yet, he had lost his, and I was losing what little remained of mine just by standing here, by watching this atrocity unfold. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't logic. It wasn't reason. It was a raw, primal surge of defiance against the world that had crushed me. It was a rebellion against my own powerlessness. Before I could process the thought, the words were leaving my mouth, my voice hoarse, but clear enough to cut through the grimy air. £2. Every head in the square swiveled to face me. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whistling wind. £2 was a ludicrous sum for such a lot. It was more than the prize Sal had fetched earlier that morning. The auctioneer's jaw hung slack for a moment, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from me to the 2 coins I had pulled from my pocket and held up for him to see. Then he looked at the farmer and the blacksmith, who were staring at me as if I'd lost my mind. Perhaps I had. £2 from Lord Finch, the auctioneer finally stammered, recovering himself. £2. Going once, going twice. He looked around, his gaze sweeping the stunned faces. No other bids were forthcoming. He slammed his gavel down on the wooden block with a resounding crack. Sold. To Lord Alistair Finch for £2. A wave of nausea washed over me. What had I done? I had just spent my last shillings on a nameless, faceless woman, an act of sheer, self-destructive madness. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me as I walked forward, my legs unsteady, and placed the 2 coins into the auctioneer's sweaty palm. He handed me a hastily scribbled bill of sale and the end of the rope that bound the woman's hands. "She's all yours, my lord," he said with a wink. "Enjoy your purchase." I ignored him, turning to the still, shrouded figure beside me. The burlap sack seemed to mock me, a symbol of my impulsive folly. The auctioneer, counting the coins, suddenly paused. "Wait a moment. The bill of sale requires a name. For the record." He gestured impatiently at the woman. "Take that ridiculous thing off her head, so she can speak." Before I could even think of how to respond, the woman moved. Her bound hands came up slowly, deliberately, and grasped the bottom edge of the sack. She didn't wait for me or anyone else. With a single, fluid motion, she pulled it up and over her head, dropping it to the wooden platform. The crowd let out another collective gasp, but this time it was not of disgust, but of shock. Her hair was a dark cascade of tangled waves, framing a face that, despite being smudged with dirt, held a striking, delicate beauty. But that wasn't what held the crowd's attention. It was the scar. A thin, jagged line of pale, raised tissue ran from the corner of her left eye down across her cheek, a stark map of some past violence. The auctioneer, flustered, cleared his throat. "Well, your name, girl. Speak up." She turned her head, and for the first time, her eyes met mine. They were a deep, stormy gray, and in their depths, I saw not fear, not submission, but a defiant, burning ember of pride. She drew a steadying breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the hoarse whisper of a broken creature, but clear and resonant, carrying across the silent market square. "My name is Alara," she said, her gaze never leaving mine. "Alara Vance." The name struck me with the force of a physical blow. Vance. It was a name I knew as well as my own. It was the name of the family my father had been accused of swindling into utter ruin, the very feud that had been the catalyst for our own downfall. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder now. A few of the older merchants and landowners recognized the name, and the implications of it hung in the air, thick and suffocating. My world, already tilted on its axis, began to spin into a new, terrifying orbit. It was a name that echoed with the force of a tidal wave in that small, muddy market square. I wonder if you've ever had a moment like that, where a single sound changes everything. Let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching this story from. For a long moment, I could do nothing but stare at her, the name Vance echoing in the hollow chambers of my memory. The world around me seemed to fade into a dull, humming background. The faces of the crowd, the smell of the market, the chill in the air, it was all secondary to the impossible reality standing before me. Alara Vance, daughter of the man my father was said to have driven to financial ruin and, ultimately, to an early grave. The feud between our houses had been the stuff of county legend, a bitter war of contracts and commerce that had left both families bleeding. And now, the last remnant of that war was standing on a wretched auction block, and I, the last remnant of my own fallen house, had just purchased her for the price of few farm tools. The crowd's murmurs grew into a low buzz of gossip. I could see the story already taking shape in their eyes. The ruined Lord Finch, in a final act of spite or madness, buying the daughter of his family's sworn enemy. They saw drama, scandal, a tale to be told over warm ale for weeks to come. I saw only the cruel, twisted irony of fate. I had to get her away from them, away from their prying, judgmental eyes. Without a word, I took hold of the coarse rope that was still looped around her wrists. It felt wrong in my hand, a brand of shame for us both. I gave a slight tug, a silent command to follow, and turned my back on the market square. She followed without resistance, her steps light but sure on the muddy ground. We walked in a bubble of stunned silence, the crowd parting before us as if we were lepers. The journey back to Finchwood was the longest in my life. My only remaining possession of any real use was a rickety cart and an old, sway-backed horse named Hector, who moved with all the enthusiasm of a condemned man on his way to the gallows. I untied Alara's hands, an act that felt like the barest minimum of decency, and gestured for her to sit on the hard wooden bench of the cart. I took the reins, and with a weary click of my tongue, urged Hector into a slow, plodding walk. The landscape of Norfolk unfolded around us, flat and bleak under a sky the color of slate. The fields were fallow, the trees skeletal and bare. It was a perfect mirror for the state of my soul. We did not speak. The silence was a third passenger in the cart, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled the space between us. I did not look at her, focusing instead on Hector's plodding gait, on the ruts in the muddy road. But I was aware of her every moment. I could feel her gaze on the side of my face, studying me. What did she see? The son of her family's destroyer? A fool who'd thrown away his last coins on a whim? I imagined her hatred for me must be a vast and deep ocean, and I was adrift in its center. My own thoughts were a maelstrom. This single act had resurrected all the ghosts I had tried so hard to bury. The whispers of my father's disgrace, the accusations, the shame, it was all fresh again, embodied in the woman sitting silently beside me. After what felt like an eternity, the crumbling stone gateposts of Finchwood Manor came into view. One of the gates hung crookedly from a single hinge, a permanent, pathetic wave to passers-by. The drive was choked with weeds, and as the house itself emerged from behind a stand of dying oaks, I saw it through her eyes for the first time. It was not a lord's manor. It was a tombstone. The stone was dark with damp, moss climbing the walls like a disease. Several of the grand windows on the ground floor were boarded up, remnants of a desperate attempt to fend off creditors and the cold. I saw her posture change slightly. I saw her stormy gray eyes widen, just for a second. There was a flicker of disbelief, of confusion. This was not the opulent den of the villain she had imagined. This was a ruin. I brought the cart to a halt in the overgrown courtyard and slid off the bench, my limbs stiff. "We are here," I said, my voice sounding hollow and foreign. She said nothing, simply looking at the great, decaying house before us. Then her gaze shifted to me, and for the first time, I saw something other than defiance in her eyes. It was a flicker of understanding? No, that was too much to hope for. It was a reassessment. She was reevaluating the story she had told herself for years. The great oak door groaned in protest as I pushed it open. We stepped in the grand hall, and a wave of cold, stagnant air washed over us. The hall was vast and cavernous, but utterly empty. The tapestries were gone, the portraits sold, the furniture auctioned off. All that remained were pale rectangles on the walls where paintings once hung, like ghosts of a happier time. Our footsteps echoed on the stone floor, the sound bouncing off the high, cobweb ceilings. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of gray light that penetrated the grimy, arched windows. I led her through the echoing emptiness, the silence between us growing heavier with each step. I couldn't bear it any longer. I stopped in the center of the hall and turned to face her. The dirt on her cheek couldn't hide the paleness of her skin, the weariness that clung to her like a shroud. "Is it true?" I asked, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. "Are you truly Alara Vance?" She lifted her chin, a familiar spark of defiance returning to her eyes. "I am, daughter of Lord Julian Vance, a man whose name I'm certain your father remembered well." The accusation was laid bare, sharp and cold as a shard of glass. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. My father remembered nothing at the end. He died a broken man, Alistair, consumed by the very debts he was accused of inflicting upon others. "This," I said, gesturing to the cavernous, empty hall around us, "this is his legacy. This is the great Finch fortune." She looked around, truly taking in the scale of the decay. "My family lost everything," she said, her voice low but intense. "Our home, our lands, our name. We were driven into exile, forced to live in squalor. My father died of a broken heart, believing your family had orchestrated our ruin." My gaze fell, unintentionally, to the scar on her cheek. It was a stark, angry line against the delicate skin. She must have noticed, because she instinctively raised a hand and touched it, her expression hardening. "And this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage, "is a souvenir from the world your greed created. A world with no place for a penniless noblewoman." I had no answer for that. What could I say? That my family was innocent? I had only my father's desperate, rambling denials from his final days, words I had clung to out of filial duty, not conviction. In the eyes of the world, the Finches had destroyed the Vances. Looking at her then, standing in the heart of my own ruin, I saw the full, horrifying scope of what I had done. I had not saved a woman from an auction. I had bought a living, breathing testament to my own family's shame. She was not a complication. She was a reckoning. The £2 I'd spent felt less like a purchase price, and more like a down payment on a debt I could never hope to repay. The animosity between us was a palpable thing, a crackling energy in the cold air. Yet beneath it, a new awareness was dawning. We were not simply enemies. We were the last survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of floating wreckage. The anger and accusation seemed to drain out of the room, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of our predicament. We were trapped, here, together. I let out a long, slow breath, my shoulders slumping. "There are rooms upstairs," I said, my voice flat. "They're empty and cold, but they have doors that lock. You may choose any one you wish." It wasn't an offer of comfort, merely a statement of fact. "I have nothing to offer you but a roof that mostly keeps the rain out." She watched me for a long moment, her gray eyes searching my face. I imagined she found nothing there but exhaustion. Finally, she gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an armistice. A temporary ceasefire in a war that had already claimed everything from us both. We were no longer Finch and Vance. a lord and his purchase. We were two ghosts, haunting the same forgotten house, and a long, cold night was drawing in. The first few days were a silent, carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. We were two celestial bodies trapped in the same decaying orbit, circling one another, but never making contact. She had chosen a room in the East Wing, as far from my own dreary chambers as possible. The house was our silent chaperone, its vast, empty spaces ensuring we rarely had to cross paths. But survival is a demanding master, and it does not allow for the indulgence of personal animosity. The cold was our first common enemy. The nights were long and bitter, and the need for a fire was absolute. I took to the woods, the axe feeling familiar and heavy in my hands. The rhythmic work of felling dead branches was a balm to my frayed nerves. When I returned with a load of wood, I would find she had been busy in her own quiet way. She had found a set of old linens, miraculously spared from the creditors, and was meticulously mending them. She had swept the thick layer of dust from the great stone fireplace in the kitchen, the only room that felt remotely habitable, and had laid the kindling with a practiced hand. We worked in tandem, without speaking, our actions forming a silent conversation. I provided the wood. She created the hearth. I used the snares my father had taught me to use as a boy to catch a rabbit. She found a small patch of wild herbs near the collapsed kitchen garden and prepared a broth that was surprisingly savory. We ate our first meals together in silence, sitting on opposite sides of a rough-hewn wooden table, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on the stone walls around us. The silence was still there, but its character had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the cart, but a lighter, more contemplative quiet. It was the silence of two people working, eating, surviving. One evening, watching her add a sprig of thyme to the pot, I broke the unspoken rule. "You know a great deal about herbs," I said, my voice startling in the quiet room. She didn't look up from her task. "My mother taught me," she replied, her tone even. She believed a lady should be of use, not just an ornament. She said knowledge of the earth was a more valuable dowry than a chest full of lace. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet statement of fact. It was the first glimpse she had given me into her life before the ruin, a life that existed outside the shadow of the Finches. Slowly, tentatively, the walls began to come down. Not the great, historical walls of Vance and Finch, but the smaller, personal ones we had erected around ourselves. I learned that her composure was a shield for a fierce intelligence. She learned that my sullen silence was a mask for a deep and abiding shame. We were not friends. We were not even allies. We were simply two people who had discovered that the weight of survival is easier to bear when it is shared. We were a partnership born of pure necessity, a fragile ecosystem in a world of decay. This fragile piece was shattered one crisp afternoon by the sound of a horse's hooves in the courtyard, a sound so alien to Finchwood now that it felt like a violation. I looked out the grimy kitchen window to see a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming with health, a stark contrast to my own skeletal nag. The man dismounting was just as immaculate. Baroncroft. He was a man in his late 40s, handsome in a predatory way, his expensive riding coat unblemished by the mud of the road. He had been a friend of my father's, always present, always offering advice, his words like smooth, polished stones. I had learned too late that those stones were what he used to pave his own path over the ruins of other men's lives. Alara had moved to the shadows of the doorway, her presence small but distinct. I stepped outside to meet him, my posture as straight as I could make it. "Finch," he said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. He surveyed the crumbling facade of the manor with a look of theatrical pity. "My dear boy, it pains me to see you living like this. Truly, what do you want, Croft?" I asked, dispensing with the pleasantries. "I have come as a friend," he said, his voice a low, reasonable purr. "I have a new offer for this place. A final offer. Enough for you to leave this pile of stones behind, start fresh somewhere. America, perhaps. It's a generous offer, born of my affection for your father's memory." His affection had been the poison in my father's cup. "The answer is the same as it was last time," I said, my voice tight. "The land is not for sale." Croft's smile tightened. "Don't be a fool, Alistair. Pride is a luxury you can no longer afford. Look at this place. Look at you. What are you clinging to? Ghosts? Memories?" His eyes then slid past me and fixed on Alara, who stood half-hidden in the doorway. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his lips. He recognized her. I could see it in the flash of his eyes. Well, he drawled, his gaze raking over her, lingering on her scar with deliberate insolence. "I see you've acquired some company. Has it truly come to this, Finch? Spending your last pennies on damaged goods from the market square? I must say, I didn't think even you could fall so far." The insult was a physical thing, hanging in the air between us, venomous and vile. It was aimed at me, but it struck her. I saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. In that instant, something hot and unfamiliar surged through my veins. It was a protective instinct so fierce it shocked me. The ghosts of Vance and Finch, of debt and feud, were burned away by the clean, bright fire of pure rage. I took a step forward, placing myself directly between Croft and the doorway, shielding Alara from his view. My voice, when I spoke, was dangerously quiet. "Baron," I said, my eyes locked on his. "This is my home, and this lady is under my protection. You will address her with the respect due to her station, or you will not address her at all. Now, I suggest you get back on your magnificent horse and leave my property." For the first time since I'd known him, Baron Croft looked genuinely surprised. He was accustomed to a broken, compliant Alistair Finch. He was not prepared for this one. He saw something in my eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. His face contorted into a mask of pure malice. "You will regret this, boy," he snarled. "When you are starving and freezing in this mausoleum, you will remember this day and my generosity." He turned without another word, swung himself onto his horse, and galloped away, leaving a tense, charged silence in his wake. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my fist still clenched. I had not felt such a surge of strength in years. I had defended my home. I had defended her. Slowly I turned. Alara had stepped out of the shadows. She was looking at me, and the mistrust, the animosity that had always been in her eyes, was gone. In its place was something new, something I couldn't yet name. In that moment, standing together against the receding threat of a common enemy, the final wall between us crumbled into dust. We were no longer just two survivors. We were a bulwark. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was the hope that even in total ruin, a foundation can be laid anew. If you believe in second chances and wish to see how our story unfolds, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Croft's visit, as vile as it was, had lanced a boil. The poisoned air of suspicion that had lingered between Alara and me for weeks was finally gone, replaced by something clean and sharp. A shared enemy is a powerful bond, perhaps the most powerful of all. We began to talk, truly talk, not just about the practicalities of survival, but about the past. She spoke of her mother's garden, of the books she had read, of a life that felt as distant as a star. I spoke of my own childhood at Finchwood, of learning to ride in the very courtyard where Croft had insulted her, of the hopes my father had once held for me. We never spoke of the feud directly. We didn't have to. It was the great, unspoken chasm we were now carefully building a bridge across, one story at a time. The alliance forged in that moment was tested almost immediately. A harsh winter began to settle over Norfolk, bringing with it a biting, relentless cold that our small kitchen fire could barely hold at bay. Our woodpile, once a respectable size, dwindled at an alarming rate. We needed more fuel, and the woods were now blanketed in a thick layer of snow, making foraging a difficult and dangerous task. We had to search the house, to scavenge from its very bones to keep from freezing. We plundered rotted furniture and broken floorboards from the unused wings of the manor, but it was never enough. This grim necessity led us to a place I had avoided since my father's death, his study. The room was on the ground floor, its door perpetually closed, a silent monument to his final despair. Pushing it open felt like breaking a seal on a tomb. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay, but also something else, the faint, lingering scent of my father's pipe tobacco. Everything was as he had left it. A quill lay next to a dried-up inkwell on his great mahogany desk. A half-empty glass stood beside it, a permanent testament to an interrupted thought. I felt a familiar wave of grief wash over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. Alara must have sensed it. She came to stand beside me, her presence a quiet anchor in the swirling sea of my memory. She didn't speak, she didn't touch me, but her solidarity was as real as the cold floor beneath my feet. "We are only looking for wood," she said softly, her voice gently pulling me back to the present. Nothing more. We set to work, our task grimly practical. The room was lined with bookshelves, filled with rotting tomes on law, agriculture, and philosophy. They were water-damaged and worm-eaten, their knowledge lost to time and neglect. They would, however, burn. As I reached for a thick, leather-bound volume, my fingers slipped, and I had to pull harder. With a groan of protesting wood, not just the book, but the entire shelf section gave way, collapsing in a cloud of dust and splintered timber. And there, on the floor where the shelf had stood, was a single, slightly raised floorboard. My heart began to pound. It was so perfectly a cliché, a secret from a cheap novel, yet there it was. I knelt, my fingers finding the edge, and lifted. Beneath it was a dark, square hollow, and nestled inside was a heavy, iron-bound chest, about the size of a loaf of bread. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and locked with a small, rusted padlock. We carried it back to the kitchen, a shared, unspoken excitement crackling between us. It was heavy, far too heavy to be empty. Using the iron poker from the fireplace, I worked at the rusted lock, leveraging it back and forth until with a sharp crack it broke. With trembling hands, I lifted the heavy lid. There were no jewels inside, no gold coins. My brief, foolish fantasy of a hidden family fortune vanished. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with paper. There were 2 thick, leather-bound ledgers and several bundles of letters, tied neatly with faded silk ribbons. I recognized my father's elegant, sloping handwriting instantly. A profound sense of dread and reverence washed over me. This was my father's secret heart, a place I had no right to be. Alistair, Elara said, her voice gentle. Perhaps we should. No, I said, a new resolve hardening inside me. We must. We sat at the table, the box between us, and by the flickering light of the fire, we opened the first ledger. At first, it seemed like a simple record of farm accounts and household expenses. But Elara, whose mind for details was far sharper than my own, noticed something odd. These numbers, she whispered, tracing a line with her finger. They don't match the debts I heard spoken of. They are smaller. She picked up the second ledger. The cover was unmarked. She opened it. It was a second set of books. A private record. Here, the numbers told a different story. Here were records of huge payments to investment brokers, disastrous ventures in shipping and futures, all brokered through one recurring name, Baron Croft. A cold knot formed in my stomach. We turned to the letters. They were unsent, addressed to his younger brother, my uncle, who had been lost at sea years before. They were a journal of his soul. The early letters were full of optimism, detailing Croft's brilliant advice, the surefire investments that would restore the Finch fortune. Then, the tone began to change. There was confusion, then worry, then a creeping, sickening dread as every single venture failed, each failure plunging my father deeper into Croft's debt. Then we came to the last bundle of letters. The ink was different, hurried and blotchy. My father wrote of a chance meeting with Lord Vance, your father, Elara. He wrote that in their shared misery, they had begun to talk, comparing the advice Croft had given them. The awful, monstrous truth had dawned on them. Croft had been playing them against each other from the very beginning. He had advised my father to invest in a new shipping line, while secretly advising Lord Vance to invest in the rival company, knowing both would be crippled in the ensuing price war. He created the feud, stoked the flames of their pride, all while positioning himself to buy up their lands and assets for a pittance when they inevitably collapsed. The final letter was dated 2 days before the carriage accident that had killed her father and left her with that scar. My hands trembled as I read the words aloud, my voice a hoarse whisper. He knows, my father had written. Vance and I are to meet with the magistrate in Norwich. We have proof of his fraud. I fear what he will do. The man is a viper, and I have let him into my home, my life. I fear for my family. I fear for the Vances. He will not let this be exposed. He will stop at nothing. The letter slipped from my fingers and fluttered onto the table. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the hiss and crackle of the fire that now seemed to mock our discovery. I looked at Elara. Tears were streaming silently down her cheeks, but her eyes were not filled with the old hatred for me or my name. They were filled with a shared, devastating grief. My father was not a fool or a villain. Her father was not a rival. They were both victims, murdered and ruined by the same man. Her scar was not a mark of shame. It was a wound of war, inflicted by the man who had destroyed us all. The great, towering mountain of guilt and shame I had carried my entire adult life crumbled into dust. The pain of that truth was immense, but it was a clarifying pain. It was a fire that burned away all the lies, leaving only a single, hard, undeniable purpose. The proof was there, in faded ink and brittle paper. A truth so vile it had to be brought to light. If this fight for justice resonates with you, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with others who appreciate stories where the truth, no matter how buried, finally wins. We looked at each other across the table. The damning evidence spread between us. We were no longer victims. We were the inheritors of a battle. And now, we knew exactly who our enemy was. In the quiet, cold hours before dawn, the nature of our world had been rewritten. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, but a different kind of fire had been lit within us. The stack of letters and ledgers on the table was no longer just evidence of a crime. It was a testament to the fathers we had lost and a map to the justice we were owed. There was no discussion, no debate. We both knew what had to be done. Our personal grief had been forged overnight into a shared, unyielding resolve. Croft had to answer for what he had done. Our first challenge was practical. The journey to Norwich was not a short one, and we needed money for a proper coach and lodgings. We couldn't risk the slow, conspicuous journey in my old cart. Croft was a man of influence, with eyes and ears throughout the county. We had to move quickly and quietly. I looked around the desolate manor, at the bare walls and empty spaces. There was nothing left to sell. Nothing except the last vestige of my old life. I reached into my coat pocket and my fingers closed around a small, heavy object. My father's signet ring. It was gold, bearing the Finch crest, and it was the one thing the creditors had overlooked. It was my last link to the man I thought my father was. Without hesitation, I pulled it from my finger. It no longer represented a legacy of shame, but one of sacrifice. Elara watched me, understanding dawning in her eyes as I placed it on the table between us. It was a fair price to pay for justice. The journey to Norwich was a world away from our first, silent trip from the market. We sat side by side in a hired coach, the damning evidence wrapped securely and hidden in a travel bag. We were partners now, equals in a high-stakes gambit. We spoke in low tones, planning our approach, rehearsing the story the documents told. I saw the strength in her, a resilience that had been there all along, buried beneath layers of trauma and grief. I realized with a startling clarity that I was no longer just fighting for my father's honor. I was fighting for her, for the woman who had survived the unthinkable and whose courage now gave me my own. Magistrate Thompson was a man whose reputation for integrity was as solid as the stone walls of his office. He was old, with a stern, deeply lined face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened to our request for a private audience with skepticism, his gaze lingering on my worn coat and Alara's scarred cheek. But something in our earnestness must have persuaded him, because he dismissed his clerk and led us into his private study, the room smelling of old paper and beeswax. I began, my voice steady, laying out the ledgers on his polished desk, explaining the 2 sets of books, the fraudulent investments, the name of Baron Croft appearing like a spider at the center of a vast, intricate web. The magistrate listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He was a man who dealt in facts, not emotion, and I could see he was reserving judgment. Then, Alara spoke. She stepped forward into the light, and she did not speak as a victim, but as a witness. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she told him of her family's exile, of her father's despair, of the accident on the road that had changed her life forever. She did not hide her scar. She gestured to it, her touch gentle, as if presenting a piece of irrefutable evidence. Baron Croft did not just steal our money, sir, she said, her gray eyes locking with his. He stole my father's life and tried to steal my future. These papers prove his greed. I am the proof of his cruelty. The final piece was my father's last letter. I handed it to the magistrate. He read in silence, his brow furrowed. As he reached the final, terrified lines, his stern facade finally cracked. His jaw tightened, and a look of cold, profound anger settled in his eyes. He looked from a letter in his hand to the pale, jagged line on Alara's face, and in that moment, the entire story clicked into place for him. He slowly placed the letter on his desk and looked at us, his gaze no longer skeptical, but filled with a grim respect. Lord Finch, Lady Alara, he said, his voice a low rumble. What you have brought me today, this is a matter of the gravest importance. Justice will be sought. I give you my word. The fall of Baron Croft was as swift as it was spectacular. The magistrate was true to his word. Warrants were issued, and Croft's vast, corrupt empire, built on the ruins of honorable men, crumbled like a house of cards. His cronies abandoned him, his victims found their voice, and the full scope of his villainy was laid bare for all to see. Our names, Finch and Vance, were cleared in the public record, the story of Croft's monstrous deception replacing the old narrative of our family's feud. We returned to Finchwood Manor not with coffers full of restored gold, for the money was long gone, but with something far more valuable, our honor. The house was the same crumbling pile of stones, yet everything felt different. The air inside seemed lighter, the shadows less menacing. It was no longer a prison of shame, but a canvas, waiting for a new picture to be painted. A year later, that new picture was beginning to take shape. The great oak door now closed without a groan. The windows of the ground floor were fitted with new, clear glass that let the sunshine stream in. In the walled garden, where weeds had once grown wild, there were now neat rows of vegetables and fragrant herbs, tended to by Alara's own hands. With the small reparation awarded to us from Croft's seized estate, and with our own hard work, we were slowly, painstakingly breathing life back into the old house. It was not a grand manor, but it was a home. Our home. One summer evening, we sat together on a stone bench in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The love that had grown between us was not a fiery, tempestuous thing, but a quiet, deep-rooted certainty, as strong and steadfast as the ancient oaks that guarded our land. I took her hand, the feel of it in mine, the most precious thing I had ever known. The world still calls me Lord Finch, I said softly. But that title is just an echo. It means nothing. My real honor, my true title, is being the man who stands beside you, Alara. I looked at her, at the face that I now saw not as marred, but as beautiful, a map of the strength that had saved us both. My lordship is not of this land. It is of the heart, and you are its undisputed queen. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her stormy gray eyes, and leaned her head on my shoulder. We had found our fortune, not in a hidden chest, but in the ruins of our lives. True nobility is not inherited by title or land, but forged in character. Your greatest treasure is not what you have, but who you stand beside when you have nothing. It is a lesson I learned in the deepest darkness, a truth that became my guiding light. For more stories of love, redemption, and the triumphs of the human heart, I invite you to subscribe to our channel.